Good evening, everyone. Thank you for logging in tonight. It's great to see so many of you logging in and joining us tonight. This webinar is funded through the Farm Advisory Service and is, as the title says, Planning to Grow Cereals 2023. We'll be having a series of talks from SAC researchers and specialists on arable topics tonight, and covering some of the relevant and current issues of the day, hopefully, so that you've got some ideas and thoughts for going forward next year. And that, tonight's agenda on planning to grow cereals is we've got Neil Havis, one of the SAC plant pathologists based down at Edinburgh, giving us some of our take-home messages from the fungicide trials in this summer. We've got Henry Cresson, one of the researchers at Edinburgh as well, looking at integrated pest management under non-inversion tillage. So that's all your min-till and the impacts on growing crops under min-till. We've got Ian Bingham discussing the efficiency of foliar and soil applied nitrogen fertiliser. We've got Steve Hode giving a lowdown of the recommended cereals. And we've got David Ross, Senior Consultant and Regional Development Manager in the Northeast, here talking about soil and nutrient management for 2023. So, without further ado, if I can introduce Neil. Hello, Neil.
Oh, Ian.
I will stop sharing my screen, and hopefully I've got a helper doing the technology thing behind the scenes, Malcolm McDonald. If I stop sharing my screen here, hopefully we can get Neil's presentation up.
Okay, I'll make a start if everyone else can see it. So good evening, everyone, and thanks for the introduction, Ewan. I'm going to give a brief kind of oversight of the 2022 trials, talk about some of the things that we've seen in the trials, and maybe some thoughts for next year going forward. That's the same trial site that Ewan had up in his picture, but that's the spring barley plots. So the sun always shines in Lanark, you see, never fails. If I'm going next slide. So to summarize, what I'm going to pick on is maybe some take-home messages from the summer. Talk briefly about balancing fungicide inputs with risk, possibly. We'll have a brief kind of summary of the best use of new and alternative chemistry, and I'll give you some insight into some of the work we're doing. And lastly, I'll touch on the value of Folpet in a program, because I know it's been quite a hot topic amongst growers. But just start off by going into the 2022 growing season and what we've kind of seen in terms of cropping. So we had a drier winter than we've had in previous years. If you look at the maps there, you can see a lot of blues in 2020 and 2021, and that was a lot of wet conditions. A lot of crops were struggling to get going. But you can see on the right-hand side of that slide, if you look at the 2022, and this is against the 30-year average, so it's from 1991 to 2020. There's a lot of whites. So we're around about average rainfall. There's a few browns in there, which is slightly under, but not too many dark browns. So in terms of the winter sown crops, they had a good chance to establish. And also the fact we had a bit more rain meant the disease had a good chance to establish as well. But of course, 2022 was a record-breaking year for so many reasons. If you look on the graph on the left, it's spring 2022, and you can see that the max temps, that's the mean maximum temperature against the 30-year average. There's a lot of red, so we're at least 1 degree above in spring. And of course, and you move across, the middle graph is comparing the maximum temperatures against the 1961 to 1990 anomaly. So the graph on the left would make you think, well, it hasn't been too warm. But if you look at where we were Many years before that, it's a considerably warmer. We're 2 degrees warmer. And on the right-hand side, we have summer 2022, and that's against the 1991 to 2020 record. And you can see, especially in the south of England, there's a lot of dark reds. There's some bright reds coming up the east coast of Scotland. I don't have to tell you, we know that was one of the warmest summers, if not, well, the warmest summer we've ever had, because all the records were broken. The question is this a sign of things to come, or is this just a one-off? So that was the maximum temperatures, but what about the mean temperatures? This is the mean temperatures for spring, and you can see there's a lot of light pink, so we're just above the average in the spring. Next to that is the summer 2022. So the temperatures are up, but that's the mean temperatures are up about 1 degree. So balanced out over the course of the summer, it wasn't quite as extreme. You would think, well, temperatures are up 1 degree up, and that's the mean temperature, but not substantially in Scotland as they would have been further south, and you can see the bright reds on the map. So that was mean temperatures, but what about rainfall? We know rainfall, along with temperature, is one of the big drivers of disease. If you look on the graph on the left, in spring 2022, there's a lot of browns in there, and the rainfall was well down on the 30-year average. And across in the middle of the screen, you can see the rainfall amount for summer 2022, and again, you're down to 50% of the average of the 30-year average rain. So again, the crops are having warm temperatures, and there was a lot of dry conditions as well, and considerably less rainfall than we're used to. And one of the patterns we're seeing is dry spring. So I'll just put this graph up. The graph on the left is April 2020, and that was the start of an 8-week dry period. Look at all the dark browns on that graph. That was practically no rainfall for an 8-week period. In the middle, we've got April 2021. That was a 6-week dry period. Look at all the dark browns on that map. And April 2022, most of the dark browns are now down in England, but we still have a lot of brown on that map. So rainfall was well down on what we'd see in a 30-year average. And the question is this the start of a pattern? We have fairly wet conditions going through the winter, or normal rainfall, and then this prolonged dry period. And it has implications for the spread of disease and winter crops. Is that implications for the good establishment of spring crops, because if there's not much moisture in the seed bed, the seed will kind of sit and it'll take a while to get going. Okay, so the take-home message just in general from the summer, what we saw is a lot of well-established disease, and so winter crops was checked by that dry period. It did come later on in the summer when we got a bit more rainfall, but it did take a while to move up the crop canopies. Okay, so in general, the disease was late coming into the crops, but we still had local disease pressure hotspots. The picture on the right is a spring barley trial at our Boghall site just outside Edinburgh, and it had a very heavy yellow rust infection, not just in the spring barley, but in the winter barley as well. So again, these are kind of general comments, but local conditions, and you have to know your local conditions and be aware of it. And it's important to keep walking your crops to see what the disease pressure is. Okay, so if you looked at the map, you would have thought, okay, we're coming out of a wet winter, then into a dry spring. That should hopefully check the splash-borne diseases. And splash-borne diseases for barley, we're thinking about Rhynchosporium. These are some results from the Rhynchosporium fungicide performance trial. It's at Lanark, again, the site you saw in Ewan's picture at the start. So here we had a good even establishment of disease within the trial. It was checked by that dry conditions, but the rain started to move it again later on, and this is the results from some of the assessments. So here, what I've put up for you here, I hope you can read the graph, is comparing the untreated against a half rate of Proline, half rate of Imtrex, half rate of Ascra X Pro, half rate of Myrisa. Okay, so the blue bars is the disease levels on the flag leaf, the red's F-1, the green is F-2. And you can see the untreated, we're up to about 25% Rhynchosporium in the untreated plots. So there's fairly heavy disease pressure. Pretty good disease control from the prothioconazole, from the fluxaperoxide, from the Ascra X Pro, the STHI azole mix, which is good It means the activity is still there. Not such a good performance from the Myrisa. That's the methyltrifluconazole. It's the straight azole fungicide from BASF. So in this case, seems to be outperformed by the other fungicides. But all the data will be going into full fungicide performance curves, which will be coming out in the next month or so, and you'll get to see them at the winter roadshows that we do just after the new year. But it looks like Brinchosporium is holding generally quite firm. I want to go back and kind of rewind to what was discussed in January this year. When Fiona Burnett was doing the roadshows, we were talking about wheat programs and what do we really need. So there was much discussion about, you'll see them in black there, the T1, the stem-based disease and protection of yield for important leaves. So the T1 and the T2, these were the really important ones. And did we see this going through into 2022? Because the advice to growers was make the maximum use of Folpet where you can, use those balanced mixtures of systemic products, limit that dose and application number of individual actives where you can, and tune doses and actives to risk. Okay, so again, the management of risk relies on walking the crops. There's been a lot of talk this year, and you'll see a lot of screens, a lot of adverts, and a lot of people talking about the new schemes where you can send leaves off to get your disease levels quantified. So we'll have Swift Detect, and we'll also have testing done by Bayer. There was a good discussion at the recent BCPC diseases review meeting about how effective these have been so far. Again, the general consensus is that these could be useful tools going forward, but I think there's going to be a lot more testing needing to be done. So at the moment, we're not recommending that these replace you walking your crop and knowing what the disease pressure is. Okay, so again, target your most effective products when you've got the most responsive timings. And in wheat, we know that's the T2 timing because you're trying to protect those top 3 leaves for as long as you can to power the photosynthesis that's going to fill the grain. We did have some new chemistry this year. There's a chance to alternate the azoles, and that was Inatrek. And you can see in the slides how Inatrek, which is Univoc. So Univoc is the Inatrek plus prothioconazole, so it's a mixed product. You can see, if you look at it, it's performing as well against Septoria as the Revistar in the protectant situation, slightly ahead of the Ascra. And we've got the red diamond there, that's the Folpet on its own, that's Arizona. Just to give you an indication of how much control you'd get from Folpet, okay? To the right of that, we've got the straight products, so you can see the Proline and the Imtrex being outperformed by the mixtures. Okay, so that's what we knew going into this year. We knew in an eradicant situation, again, Univoc looked quite a useful addition to programs. And that was carried on to yield, and you can see in the previous yields that the Univoc was slightly ahead of the Revistar, ahead of the Ascra, and they're both ahead of the straight products. So this is some results from a fungicide performance trial on Barrel in East Lothian in 2022. We had fairly well-established Septoria in the crop, but then again, we had that dry period, which checked it, and the high temperatures, which also speeded the crop into senescence. But I hope you can read the axes on the graph. What we have the untreated on the left-hand side. Next to it, we have Arizona. So the bars, the blue bar is the Septoria on the flag leaf. The red bar is the green leaf area on the flag leaf. The green bar is the Septoria on leaf F-1. The purple bar is the green leaf area on F-1. So you can see as you move across from right to left, you've got the untreated. So you can see some disease, quite a lot of Septoria. You move across, you've got Arizona, that's Folpet on its own. Next to that, you've got the Proline on its own. Next to that, you've got the Revistar on its own, so you can see fairly good reduction in those disease bars. Next to that, you've got Univoc, and if you look at Univoc, you can see you've got better control of disease, especially in the flag leaf, and more green leaf area. Okay, so that's the Inatrek plus prothioconazole. You've got the Myrisa, which is the methyltrifluconazole on its own, and again, you can see it's done quite a good job on disease control, and next to it is Peptiga. That's the Fenpicoxamid, which is the new QII fungicide as a straight. Okay, so you can see they've done a fairly effective control of the disease in the trials. The blue line you'll see on the graph is the yield in the plots. So you can see as you go from the untreated, just over 10 tons per hectare, and look at that line there at Univoc. This is half rate Univoc there, and it's up touching 12. So again, this is a result from one trial. This is a T2 spray, but it certainly seems to vindicate what we saw in the previous trials and the previous graphs. The Univoc slightly ahead of the Revistar in terms of the yield response and the yield benefit in controlling the disease. Okay, so we'll see what the addition of the other trials across the rest of the UK give to those graphs. So something else that we're looking at as part of the new RESAS program, we're looking at alternatives to conventional pesticides. And we're looking at things like biostimulants. So there's a lot of discussion, I know, in the press about seaweed extracts and chitins to stimulate the crop. And there's also microbial biostimulants, so things like non-pathogenic fungi like Trichoderma species and Arbuscula mycorrhiza. They're known to be biostimulants, so there's a lot of interest in them as an alternative to conventional pesticides. You've got elicitors, so these mimic the action of natural elicitors, so things like chitosan, which is part of cell membranes. So chitosan is produced from, it's, as you can see in the picture, is from crustaceans. They just grind up the shells and you just apply it to the crop and it elicits the defense response. There are things like phosphite, which are natural elicitors. They generate the defense response as well. There's a product called Bion, which mimics the signal that the plant receives when it's under attack from the pathogen, or you can even use the pathogen itself. So the pathogen actually elicits the defense response in the host plant. And then, of course, there's biofungicides. So there's a lot of talk about bacteria, things like the Bacillus species, or fungi, again, the Trichoderma species we mentioned before. So there's a lot of products coming to market now and a lot of research and interest into a lot of these bacteria going forward. Okay, so what we've been looking at is some detailed work. We've been trying to compare a lot of these products in small scale trials on their own. And you can see there, this is an barley program. So the recommendation for a lot of these elicitors is to use them early. So you can see we've got them at T0 and T1. And then we also had them in combination with fungicides. So some of the biologicals, the only thing you can use in combination with them is Amistar when you're applying it. And then we followed that up with a kind of reduced rate Revistar and Folpet just to see how the disease control was going. And some brief results. I'm sorry that slide's appeared small. I should have checked the size of that. Hope you can make that out. On the right-hand side is the same treatments I showed in the previous slide. On the left-hand side, you've got percentage leaf area, and this is Rhynchosporium at our bog hole trial site at Lanark. And we're looking at 3 varieties because one of the challenges of incorporating this new technology is in eliciting the defense response, you often get differences between varieties. So we thought we'd better check some varieties. So you can just about make out there's some small bars representing Fairing. Fairing has a resistance rating of 8 to Rhynchosporium, so not surprisingly, it didn't have much Rhynchosporium. The yellow bars is SY Tungsten, it's one of the newer varieties. It only has a rating of 3, but if you can see, if you look at those bars, apart from the untreated, which is 1, all of the treatments seem to have given quite significant control of Rhynchosporium, which is good. The grey bars, of course, is Laureate, our most popular spring barley variety. And you can see, if you look to the left, we have untreated, laminarin treatment. We're not seeing much control until we get to treatments 10 and 11, which is the first treatments where we bring in a T2 fungicide spray. And there we're seeing some disease control, okay? But it takes a long time to get to that. And that was with laminarin. So laminarin is the brown seaweed-based extract, which has a registration for use on wheat. I know that UPL are actively seeking to get registration for use of laminarin on barley. So barley, use the laminar as a T0 spray to induce a defense response. You can go in with another dose of laminar, 0.25 a litre of Amistar, and then a reduced rate Revistar and Folpet, and it is giving you a significant control of Rhynchosporium. And likewise, the one next to it. Now, AminoFlow is an amino acid. It's a biostimulant. We have seen quite interesting results with it in terms of promoting and boosting yield in spring barley. In those cases, we didn't see much in terms of disease control, but it certainly gave a boost in yield, not specifically in the specific weight of the grain, but in the yield response. And the last one I'll just point out is 16, which is the phosphite. Again, this is another elicitor of defense response, and it's giving quite a significant reduction in Rhynchosporium in this trial. So these are small scale plots just to test some of these new products. We had some bigger trials with yielded plots, and here we wanted to compare untreated programs, untreated reduced rate fungicide. Again, we wanted to compare one elicitor product with one biological and one biostimulant. So the laminar is the elicitor, the serenade is Bacillus subtilis, it's the biological, the AminoFlow is the biostimulant. So we looked again, like 2 varieties in trials. We looked to see what we got in terms of reduced disease and also improved yield in the trials. Okay, so these are some pictures from the Laureate. If you look on the left-hand side, this is taken at our Spotsmain site in East Lothian. You can see we have on the left-hand side, you've got untreated, so you can see there's some disease, certainly at the base of the crop. In the middle, you've got the reduced rate fungicide, and you can see the crop canopy remains greener down to the bottom. To the right-hand side, you've got the biological and reduced rate. So it looks like the biological and reduced rate is not done quite as well as the reduced rate fungicide. Okay, those just some initial observations and some pictures. Next to that, of course, more importantly, is the disease data. So on the left-hand side, these are results from the same trial, which was replicated at Lanark. So this is Ramularia. On the left-hand side, we've got results for fairing. On the right-hand side, we've got results for Laureate. So if you remember, treatment 1 was the untreated, 2 was your reduced rate fungicide, 3 and 4 was the laminar, 5 and 6 was the biological, 7 and 8 was the AminoFlow. Okay, so again, if you look in the bars, it looks like the AminoFlow plus the reduced rate fungicide has given the best reduction in terms of Ramularia. And if you look at the green bar, which is the one we're interested in, is yield, of course. It's treatment 3. So this is the one with laminarin, which seems to have given that yield response. So we've seen that previously in many other trials. Laminarin early on certainly gives you a yield response compared to the untreated, but in this trial, the results were variable. To the right of it, we've got the results from Laureate, the same trial. And if you look, you can see we're seeing much less of a yield response. That's fairly flatlining. In terms of disease response, again, this time we're not seeing that same response with the AminoFlow. We're not seeing as good a response with the laminar. And again, this is just making the point, introducing these new kind of technologies, we are going to get differences between varieties. So we need to do a lot more field trials before we let these products go to market with firm recommendations. Okay, so last thing I wanted to move on to was the position and the value of Folpet in a barley program. And these are some trials. We did a small trial for a company looking at Folpet in the program, which is Arizona, comparing how Folpet did when it was either applied as a T1.5 or a T2 timing. Okay, so it was a normal program, and you either added the Arizona at T1.5 growth stage 39 or later on at T2 growth stage 49. And again, what we saw in the trials, so the blue bar is Rhynchosporium in the flag leaf, the orange is Ramularia in the flag leaf, the grey bar is Rhyncho on F-1, and the yellow one is Ramularia on F-1. So again, you can see 1 is the untreated. If you look across and see the timings, so it looks like 3, which is the Folpet, just being introduced in the program, gave a fairly good control of Rhynchosporium. And remember, Folpet does have a label recommendation for wrinkle control. So it gave fairly good wrinkle control. But if you look at the y-axis, you will see these are fairly low disease pressures in the trial. So if the disease pressure had been higher, and we also had the warm temperatures made that crop senesce fairly rapidly, so we might have seen more of a yield response. But you can see we have a boost compared to the untreated in terms of yield. So we've gone up from about 7.3 to just under 7.8, so half a ton per hectare, but more of a decline later on. So we didn't see the yield benefit, which was a surprising in that trial. But I think with a bit longer preservation of green leaf area, we might have seen significant yield response. We also had a Folpet into a program in winter barley. So these are some pictures just to give you a comparison. On the left-hand side, this is NLG Mountain. You've got untreated, so you can see quite significant levels of ramularia. In the middle picture is a conventional program, so that's a T1 and a T2 STHI and azole mix. And on the right-hand side, you've got the Folpet added to the same program, and you can see quite a significant reduction in disease to the fact that it's almost a standout in terms of being clean compared to the other treatments. Unfortunately, when we took this trial to yield as well, we didn't see a significant difference in yield, which again is quite surprising given that significant disease control. Okay. So lastly, in just conclusion, as I've said at the start, 2022 is a record-breaking year in terms of temperature, how we manage the crops going forward, and how the crops are able to stand up to these higher temperatures and lower rainfall is going to be a challenge for us to monitor going forward. If we do get prolonged dry periods, they're going to affect some diseases more than others. So thinking back to what I was talking about, Rhynchosporium and Septoria, there are these splash-borne diseases. They're going to be more affected than others in terms of moving up the crop. What we have seen in the trials this year, where we did get disease, the fungicides are doing a reasonable job in these high disease situations. There's no significant loss in terms of fungicide activity, which is good going forward because it means we've got some confidence in the products that we have. But again, I've mentioned the introduction of Univox, so the new fenpicoxamid, which is the QII fungicide. How are we going to manage this new chemistry and going forward? And I've touched on these new alternatives. We're looking at how we're going to manage them going forward as well, in order to so we can get the maximum use out of them, the maximum lifespan during the course of the trials and in years to go forward. Okay, so I've just about used up my time, but I'd just like to thank you again for listening, and I'll stop sharing and pass you back to Ewan and on to the next speaker.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil. That was really good. Fairly shows that Univox been working well in wheat, and it's interesting hearing some of the things about the elicitors and biostimulants. That, yeah, maybe promising work for next year then, maybe.
Hope so, hope so.
Just trying to keep to time, we will introduce Henry Creashan. Henry's a researcher down in Edinburgh. Henry has been looking at non-inversion tillage work. The talk tonight is based on some of the Mains of Lauriston funded work that he's been involved in. So Henry, I will let you share your screen and take it away, please.
Yes, so today I'm going to talk to you about some of the work we've been doing on integrated pest management under different tillage systems. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about the work we've done on barley. I'll begin by talking about the winter barley work and then move on to the spring. So there's some potential changes in disease risk that can occur as we start to move towards reduced soil inversion tillage. So min-till, direct-drill systems. Potentially an increase of damping off diseases and seedling blights if these crops are sown early and into wet and cold soil where they're not able to get away quickly, we might see more issues with pythiums and fusariums and things like that, which could be an issue. And overall, we might expect the soil-borne disease to decline due to having more crops in the rotation, though there is potentially an issue there with cover crops that are quite often used in these non-inversion tillage systems as people move towards that sort of regenerative agriculture trajectory. And those cover crops, yeah, could be carrying over disease, but also harboring pests as well, and can turn into weeds themselves. So other things to consider, because those weeds can act as disease reservoirs. So some, for instance, blackgrass will be a host for ergot, which would infect your cereal crops. We might also expect an increase in trash-borne diseases as there's more infected crop residues on the surface. You can get earlier infection, it can get more established in a crop, and could become more of an issue that way. There might also be some reductions in certain pathogens. So some of the work that ourselves and colleagues at the Hutton Institute have done recently have found that sometimes in these non-inversion tillage systems, there can be less rusts and mildews, these biotrophic fungi that feed on living material. We're not entirely sure of the mechanism there, but I might be able to offer you some explanation by the end of this talk. So we want to know which diseases are likely to increase or decrease, and what conditions is that's going to happen. What's the effect of variety, and in combination with the tillage regime and everything else on disease and therefore fungicide requirement. So we're looking to optimize the variety and fungicide choice according to the main issues present within each system, taking into account the tillage system, but also thinking about the rotational effect on diseases. As I said before, the cover crops and their management could be really important there. And also the stage of the system, the maturity stage of the system. We've seen this time and time again, where people move into more of a non-inversion tillage regime, and it can quite often be a few shaky years before the soil becomes more mature and you're able to sort of start reaping the dividends. So this is the trial. We've had 2 years of this trial. It's the third year sown in the ground now, and it's located at the Hutton site where it's irrigated, so to try to get a higher disease pressure situation. And also at a farm in Leven. Doug Christie's very kindly let us onto his field and plough up a good chunk of it. It's a very well established min-till direct drill system, and it hasn't been ploughed for about 20 years, I think, until we made a mess of it in the middle. So we've got 3 different tillage types. We've got the plough and the direct drill, either with or without infected crop residues on the surface. So that one treatment, we raked off the infected crop residues from the previous season. So it's going into a previous crop of barley and stubble there. We tested out 2 different varieties because some of the work that's been done in this very field in Leven, actually, as well as at Hutton, has found that there's a difference in terms of the ranking of varieties under the different tillage systems. So we tested this out according to the pathogens that we are most likely to experience issues with. Neil's talked about them today, Rhynchosporium and Ramularia, particularly Rhynchosporium. So the varieties we chose was Surge, which I think is still a 7 out of 9 for Rhyncho rating, and KWS Tau, which is probably about a 4 or 5 when it slipped off the list a year or so ago. We're testing these out under 4 different fungicide programs, ranging from 0 to 3 sprays. And this is a fairly sort of standard Siltra-based program. So the plots either get no sprays at all, completely untreated. They'll get just a T1 at the start of stem extension, a T1 and a T2 at Orns peeping, or they get a T1 and T2 and also a T0 in the mid-tillering stage, mostly to get on top of any sort of mildew or rust situation. So when looking at powdery mildew, this is the combination of the last 2 years of the trials, we can see that no matter what the variety, you get much higher disease levels of mildew in the ploughed plots. There are a couple of reasons for this. I mean, this is fairly early on in the season, it's like early May. So it's probably not going to be so affected by the canopy at this stage, because we know that if you overfeed, oversupply nitrogen, you get a thicker canopy, it's more humid, less airflow, really good for powdery mildew infection to go rife. There's also having more nitrogen available to the crop does other things within the plant as well, related to the cells and things like that, that can make them more susceptible to pathogen attack. As so you get that more lush growth. So these are things that could be factored in. When looking at Rincosporium, it's much more of a yield robber in Scotland, as we all know. We found that there was much more Rinco in the direct drill plots, and particularly those that had the crop residues still on the surface there. This is perhaps unsurprising. You've got lots of infected straw from previous year next to your barley plant that's just growing through. You've got that early contact and that interaction between pathogen and host, and that's really can sort of get disease going. I was in plots a couple of weeks ago, and the ploughed plots, there was no Rincosporium, but on the direct drill plots with the residues, you could already see the lesions getting to that sort of watery, bluey sort of lesion stage. So good early infection. Hopefully with the weather coming now, you'd expect a lot of that to sort of be killed off, but it's already there and it's already starting to have an effect on the crop. When looking about 3-4 weeks later in June, so fairly peak season here, this is like mid-June, to mid-June, we found that there was more mildew in the ploughed plots, particularly in the susceptible variety, which is KWS Tower. You can see that large yellow bar at the end. And at this stage, we could be seeing an effect of having this increased supply of oversupply of nitrogen, thick canopies, more humidity, more mildew. When looking at the same time period for Rincosporium, so the first couple of weeks of June, we find that there's more of this trash-borne disease in the direct drill plots of the susceptible variety Tower. We see that the big difference between the direct drill plots, whether they've got crop residue or not, and the plough plots when looking at KWS Tower on the right. And it's probably because you have more this initial inoculum in the direct drill plot. So generally speaking, our hypotheses are sort of holding true here. In the direct drill plots with the crop residues, more trash-borne diseases, Rincosporium potentially more of an issue. So thinking about fungicides and variety choice there can be really important. And then the ploughed system, more ready access to nitrogen. It's easy for the plants to get their roots through the soil, grab a lot of nitrogen really quickly as they become established, and then not, perhaps unsurprisingly, we're seeing more powdery mildew. And I know in the past there's been more rust in the plough plots in these sorts of tillage comparison systems. What we found is that, at least for Rincosporium control, there wasn't a value in having more than sort of one spray, really, and certainly wasn't a value of having that third spray. So really, if you're under the ploughed system, then you potentially, under these conditions, one spray would be enough. But having under a direct drill system, you might be more inclined to put that second spray on. You see there's quite a big jump there from, said, the green direct drill plots in around the sort of 4%. You give it an extra spray of Siltra, it's dropping down to less than 1%, and that's potentially going to have an effect on yield. Obviously, this is all depending on what's going to happen with the weather later in the season. Neil talked about earlier, you can have a lot of disease early in the season, and then a spell of dry weather, and it just kills off all the disease. So there's no hard and fast rule, but this is what we're finding for these couple of years of the trials. When looking at yields, we in 2021 found that the best yields were under the plough. However, what was interesting is there was a big jump in yield as you went from the direct drill plots to the ploughed plots at the Hutton site. And this is a very immature direct drill site in that it's only had 1 year of a barley crop that direct drilled previous to this trial starting. Whereas, as I said, the farm in Leven has been under direct drill for 20 odd years, so it's much more mature, and perhaps because of that, we're seeing a less of a difference in terms of the overall yields. So even though in that particular field, the plough was still yielding slightly more, when you factor in all the other costs associated with ploughing, more diesel, more labour, plus all the environmental considerations, greenhouse gas emissions and things like that, it's still probably more cost effective to grow in a direct drill system at those sites. What we also found is that for the more resistant variety surge in the plough plots, 1 spray was enough really. Once you've got that 1 spray, you've got up to the 7.3 tons per hectare, something around that, and actually adding any additional sprays is just going to cost you money and not achieve anything in terms of improved yields. However, when looking at the more susceptible variety on the right, KWS Tower, every additional spray added a bit more to the overall yields. Whether that last spray was particularly beneficial or not, and when you're looking at the economics of it, I'm not sure, but still, so yeah, the variety consideration is really important here when thinking about yields. Looking at the yields of this year, we found that the best yields were under the plough at Hutton. As I said, it's a more immature site compared to the Leven site, in which the best plots were those that were under direct drill. So there's certainly something to be said there for considering the maturity of the system and soil type and things like that, which will be fairly similar because they're not so far away in terms of soil series. But certainly soil history has having a big effect there on the end results. What was also interesting about last year is that when looking at the direct drill plus the infected crop residues, no matter what variety was being grown, there was an added benefit of each spray added, perhaps because that year was a bit more higher pressure, generally speaking, than the year before. So we're more likely to see those sorts of effects. Whereas the year before, under the ploughed plots, looking here, there's the ploughed plots did a lot better, generally speaking. Probably in no small part because of the weather. Whereas here you can see the direct drill plots and the ploughed plots are comparable, but still that additional benefit of those extra sprays under the high disease pressure sites important. So as I said, this trial is in the ground at the moment, and there's some pictures I took recently. You can see the picture at the bottom in the center. You can see some Lycosporium starting to develop on those direct drill plots with infected crop residue. To the left of that, you can see the ploughed plots, and to the right, the min-till with the infected crop residue. Ploughed plots obviously look much nicer at the moment, but the direct drill plots do catch up, and particularly we found in previous years at the Leven site, which is much more a mature system. So just moving away from that Lawson Trust funded venture with the Hutton Institute, I just want to briefly introduce this cover crop trial we've sown a couple of months ago at our Boghole farm. And this is looking at the effect of tillage regime in combination with cover crops and biologicals as well on barley disease. So we're looking particularly at soil-borne diseases, particularly things like fusarium, and also trash-borne diseases like Rinco and Ramularia. We're going to sow the plots as they are here for 4 consecutive years, so we can look at any carryover effects of the cover crop on these soil-borne pathogens. And there's a couple of mechanisms that could be at work here. We could be seeing increased microbial activity below the ground, which is having antagonistic effects on the pathogenic fungi in the soil. Or we could actually see other effects, thinking about the way that these cover crops can act as physical barriers to spore dispersal. And so there's lots that could be going on there. We're going to be growing spring barley after spring barley after spring barley after spring barley. And in between those spring barley crops, we're going to be growing a cover crop, which is either going to be vetch, mustard, orchard radish, or we're just going to leave it fallow. Then on top of that, we'll be applying different biologicals and elicited treatments to the spring barley crop, whilst looking at the fungal DNA levels within the soil, but also within the barley. And this is a photo I took a few weeks ago at our Boghall site with the little drone. You can see everything's coming up nicely. The min-till plots established very well. The only thing that didn't do as well at this time anyway is the hairy vetch in the min-till plots. It established, but it wasn't looking as healthy as it was in the ploughed plots. So we're going to be doing lots of different things with these plots and linking up with other groups to try to maximise this really lovely trial that you'll see at our open day in the summer. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Henry. That was pretty good. A few good, interesting things there to look at. It's very interesting to see how the yields are leveling out on the more developed min-till site, isn't it? We will crack on, however, and introduce Ian. Ian, hopefully you're sharing your screen now. Everyone can see. So Ian's going to be comparing the efficiency of foliar and soil and soil applied nitrogen fertilizer. So I know there's quite a few of you these days now spraying your crops with liquid fertilizer. So it'll be interesting to see what the differences are, Ian. Take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Ewan, and good evening, everybody. As Ewan said, what I'm proposing to do in this section is just present some of the results from what is a Mains of Lauriston Trust funded project that I'm doing with Zach Riley and Peter Lindsay from SAC Consulting. And what we're doing in that project is comparing the efficacy of foliar and soil applied nitrogen fertilizer, and the foliar nitrogen is through nozzles. It's deliberately applied to the leaves rather than sort of liquid that will then sort of drop onto the soil. Now, I've presented the results from the first year of this project at previous meetings. So here I'm just going to very briefly recap on some of the key findings from year one, but then focus on the results from year two. Now, before I do that, I think I should just explain why we became interested in this question. You'll be no stranger to the contents of this slide. This shows you what's happened to fertilizer prices. You see the massive soar in prices over the last couple of years or so. And so we're very interested in anything that we can do to try and improve the nitrogen use efficiency and then provide opportunities for applying less fertilizer. So we were sort of intrigued with the reports that were coming out in the farming press over the last 2 or 3 years that suggests that or implies that the foliar nitrogen has benefits over standard soil applied fertilizer, and suggests that foliar nitrogen could be 4 or 5 times more effective. Now, there are a number of products available on the market. They differ in their composition and in their recommendations for use. These are just 3 examples. So in the top one here, we've got Yara Safe N300. This is composed of nitrate, ammonium, and ureic nitrogen sources. And the recommendations here is for repeat applications, of in 10 to 14-day intervals of pretty low quantities here. So we're talking about 6 kilos of nitrogen at each application. Other products include things like Poly-N Plus and the Agrovital Efficient N. These are both polymers of urea of variable chain length, and the argument here is that those longer chain lengths polymers are slower to break down, so it leads to a sort of slower release of the nitrogen, increasing its availability for longer to the plant. But some of them, like the Poly-N Plus, are also formulated with micronutrients and sulfur. So not all these foliar N products are the same. The recommendations for use of Poly-N Plus and Efficient N are to apply with fungicides. So you can do it at the standard fungicide timings, T1, T2, T3, and typically you would be recommending applying something like 9 kilos per hectare to replace the final 40 to 60 kilos of soil applied ammonium nitrate. So we were kind of interested, as a crop physiologist, I'm interested in what the mechanisms are that would give us this sort of large increase in the efficiency of foliar N. And if we think about it, if we think that foliar N, its maximum efficiency of uptake, I mean, it can't exceed 100%. That's the maximum efficiency. If the foliar N is 4 to 5 times more efficient than soil applied N, it must mean that the soil applied N is only being taken up with something like 20 to 25% efficiency. And that is quite a bit lower than what we would generally accept to be the fertilizer recovery from ammonium nitrate. So that would typically be something like 60 to 70% from historic research that's been done. If we have a think about one of the other sort of recommendations, here we're talking about 9 kilos of foliar N replacing the final 50 kilos of standard N with no loss in yield. That in itself doesn't imply necessarily that the foliar N is any more efficient, because it really depends on where you are on the nitrogen response curve. If we have a look at this is a typical response curve. This was taken from this project, one of the trial sites in 2021, and this just shows you the response to the soil applied ammonium nitrate. Now, if we're up here somewhere on the response curve and we basically withhold the last final 50 kilos of nitrogen, then we would see very little change in the yield. We've hard pressed to pick that up statistically, and that's without having to replace it with any foliar N. So it really depends how you interpret these things, really depends on where you are on the response curve. It also becomes quite complex when we start thinking about indices of nitrogen and nitrogen use. So there was a report that replacing 40 kilos of nitrogen soil N with 7 kilos of foliar N on spring barley increased the yield per kilogram of nitrogen applied. But again, we have to think quite hard about what that actually means, because it again depends on where you are on the response curve. Because if we just think about this response curve here, as you reduce the amount of nitrogen, the yield that you get per unit of nitrogen applied actually increases. So you can convert this response curve into that nitrogen index on this side, on this panel here. And that's simply because of the shape of the curve. This part of the response, the crop is responding with a bigger yield increase than it is at this point here. So it doesn't matter whether you're applying the foliar N, you will still see an increase in the yield per unit of nitrogen applied, or the yield increase per unit of nitrogen applied, as you reduce the amount of nitrogen, if you simply withhold sort of the final 40 kilos. Now, we weren't able to find sort of the answers to these questions that we had in the technical literature. So along with Zach Riley and Peter Lindsay, we decided to apply for some money, and we were lucky enough to receive funding from the Mains of Lauriston Trust to fund 2 years of trials, each with winter barley and spring barley. And in the first year, what we were interested in doing was comparing different application frequencies, but using a single foliar end product that had no micronutrients in it. So in that set of trials, we were using Yara Safen. And then in year 2, what we did was to compare different foliar end products, but with just a fixed number of applications in each case. But the key features of the experimental design that cross both years is that we needed to know where we are on the nitrogen response curve. And we also, in addition to measuring the yield response to these treatments, we're also wanting to measure the crop N content, because from those data, we're then able to quantify the nitrogen use efficiency in different ways. So the experimental design in year 1 was as follows. We had 2 sites of winter barley, both with variety barrel. One was in Perthshire, Double Carney, and the other one was in East Lothian, Cold Shield. And we had just the one site of spring barley, again at Cold Shield. And the design was comparable for both the winter wheat and the spring barley experiments. And so what we did was we established a full nitrogen response using ammonium nitrate. So for the winter wheat treatments, we had plots ranging from 0 right through to 250 kilos of nitrogen in the typical sort of 1/3, 2/3 split. And then at just 2 of those rates, at 100 and 150, we had additional plots that also received foliar nitrogen. And so we had 4 different foliar nitrogen treatments, a control here that didn't have any foliar nitrogen, and then F1 treatment had 5 kilos per hectare. F2 had 2 doses of 5 kilos, giving us 10 in total, and F3 had 15 kilos in total. Now, when we looking at the results, this is what we were expecting to find. So this is the nitrogen response curve that we measured using the soil applied N. This is the ammonium nitrate. And in the red dots here, this is the expected yield. This is the yield we would have expected from applying 15 kilos of the foliar nitrogen if that 15 kilos of nitrogen was actually operating 4 to 5 times more efficiently than the soil applied N. So we'd expect a similar yield response to that 15 kilos as we would have got from 60 to 70 kilos of soil N. So we'd see the yield response sitting above the overall yield response curve for the soil applied N. That's what we were expecting to find. What we actually found was that the foliar nitrogen yields actually just sit right on top of the general yield response line. So we're getting some response to the foliar nitrogen here, but it's pretty much what you'd expect to get if you'd applied just an extra 15 kilos in each case of ammonium nitrate. So these data suggested that the response was comparable between the foliar and the soil applied nitrogen, and this was the case at the East Lothian site for winter wheat and also the spring barley site. So in year 2, what we were interested in is, well, do other foliar products behave in the same way as the Yara Safen? So we had a similar kind of design. So we were establishing the full nitrogen response curves. And then with our foliar treatments, instead of having 3 different application rates, we had the same application rate, but we had 3 different products we were comparing alongside a control without any foliar N. So the products were the Yara Safen again, the Poly N Plus, and the Efficient N. And they were all applied to the winter wheat. They got 6 kilos at 3 different application timings, giving a total application of 18 kilos per hectare. With spring barley, similar kind of design, but we only had 2 application timings here, giving a total of 12 kilos of nitrogen applied. And these are the results for grain yield. If we start here, we're looking at what happened in Aberdeen. The grey squares here are the soil applied N. So this is the nitrogen response to the soil applied N, and this is a fitted line to those grey squares. And so the grey squares represent individual replicate plots for each of these treatments. And then these coloured symbols here are the foliar nitrogen treatments that have been applied. But these are the average for the individual replicate plots because it's easier to show on a graph. But what we can see, this is very similar to the results that we found in the first year. There was very little difference between the foliar end products, and they all sit on the response line, indicating that they're responding very much the same way as the soil nitrogen does. In East Lothian, there was perhaps a little bit more sort of difference between some of the treatments. So these were statistically significant, these differences here. But we've got to interpret these against a background of much greater variability between the individual plots. So you can see here the soil end plots were behaving quite differently from one replicate to another. In the spring barley, this picture is a little bit more similar to the winter wheat in Aberdeen, where the foliar N sort of sits on the response curve. So what was it doing to grain protein and grain nitrogen? Well, again, we see a similar kind of pattern. This is the grain protein for Aberdeen and for East Lothian, and the foliar nitrogen treatments, they were increasing protein in each case, but only by the same amount that you might expect to find from adding more soil nitrogen, because they sit on the response curve. And the same for the spring barley down here. Now that would suggest that, you know, the yield response and also the fact that we're getting an increase in the grain nitrogen by applying this additional foliar N would suggest that that foliar N is getting into the crop. We can measure that directly. And yes, we can see, this is just some data from Aberdeen. You can see here that the foliar N indeed is increasing the crop N content, but it's increasing it in the same way that you might expect from an extra 18 kilos of soil N, because it sits on the response curve. But we can go a little bit further with those data. We can calculate the efficiency of nitrogen use. And two of the sort of perhaps most useful, I think, indices are the fertilizer recovery. So we can calculate the apparent fertilizer recovery by measuring the increase in the crop N content and dividing it by the amount of nitrogen applied. But in principle, you could get a crop responding in different ways to different fertilizer types, but not through an increase in the amount of fertilizer that they take up. It could be that they are utilizing that nitrogen within the tissues more effectively to produce grain yield. So that would be seen as an increase in their utilization efficiency. And we can calculate that by calculating the grain yield divided by the crop N content for our different treatments. Now, when we calculated the fertilizer recoveries, then what we found was that those treatments that were given the basal N plus the foliar N were giving us the same fertilizer recovery. There was no significant difference between these treatments compared with the basal N with no foliar fertilizer. So here we were getting a recovery of around sort of 60, 65, 66%. And in East Lothian, it was comparable. And in the spring barley at East Lothian, again, it was comparable. It was around the sort of 50, 60% mark, but no significant difference between any of the treatments. We've also tried to unpick and calculate the recovery of just the foliar component. But this is actually quite a tricky thing to do with these kind of crude measurements, because we're dealing with very small quantities of nitrogen applied. So it gets swamped with the error in the calculations and the differences between plots. But if we do calculate it and then average it across all the different foliar end products, we get a value of 47% for the recovery of the foliar end at Aberdeen. It was a little bit higher for the winter wheat at East Lothian, that was 88%, but lower in the spring barley, 33%. Average those out together, then we're looking at a typical recovery of about 50%, which is not a million miles away from what we see with the soil applied end. And then calculating the utilization efficiency. I mean, the calculation is quite straightforward, but as I mentioned at the outset, it's interpreting this index can be quite tricky, because as the content of the crop, the end content of the crop goes up with the amount of nitrogen applied, the utilization efficiency, the amount of grain produced per unit of nitrogen in the tissue, goes down. So in fact, the most efficient crop is one that's nitrogen starved. It's clearly not yielding very well, but in terms of its utilization efficiency of nitrogen, it's the best. But that's no use to us. What we're interested in is what utilization efficiency is at its optimum yield. Importantly, when we plot the utilization efficiencies for the foliar nitrogen treatments, they sit on the graph. So the higher nitrogen treatment, we see a lower utilization efficiency, but they're sitting on the line, as we saw with many of the other responses. So this would indicate that there is no greater utilization efficiency from applying those foliar products compared to the soil nitrogen. So I think in conclusion then, our study has provided little evidence of greater yield responses from soil plus foliar end compared with soil nitrogen applications on their own. And that's across 2 sites over 2 years and in 2 different crops. It's clear that the foliar nitrogen is taken up by the crop. There's good evidence of that. We can calculate that, we can measure it. But the measures of nitrogen use efficiency by the soil and foliar end are broadly comparable, and that's whether we're thinking about the fertilizer recovery, but also the utilization efficiency. So I think there is a place for foliar N in crop husbandry, in producing the crop, but we're not seeing it produce the big increases in efficiency in our study, at least, that were being reported in the press. And the other thing we've got to bear in mind is that the cost of these foliar N products can be 3 to 5 times greater per kilo of N than the ammonium nitrate. Okay, and thank you for your attention. I just want to acknowledge the funding from the Mainzer Lawrenson Trust.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was very interesting, and it's good to see the wee trial as quashed some of the reports in the press. But if anyone out there does have any interesting dilemmas, by all means, put them to us or get in contact with someone like any of your local advisors or some of the researchers, and we can help pull together a bid to try and get funding from somewhere like the Mainzer Lawrenson Trust, because that's a local trust that helps fund agricultural funded research. And I'm not sure if there's any other trusts, Ian, that you're aware of that you utilise, but it's been quite a recent fund in the last 5-10 years.
That's certainly the best. I mean, Henry's used it, Neil's used it, and they are very supportive. The only problem, because it's a trust, it doesn't actually fund staff time. It doesn't fund overhead. So yeah, there is a limited amount that we can do with it, but it is a good
Okay.
a good source, and they are very supportive.
Yeah, no, but it's yeah, you've been able to quash the newspaper articles anyway, which is and provide some good factual evidence as to what you've found. So no, thank you very much. Right then, we will move on to find out what varieties we should all be growing and how things are progressing in this recommended list. Now, Steve Hode unfortunately couldn't make it tonight. He's traveling south, so should be on a train tonight. But we've hopefully got his presentation recorded. So hopefully, with the powers of technology through PowerPoint, we should be able to look at what Steve recorded for us at the end of last week.
This presentation is a pre-launch of the new Scottish recommended list, which will be finalised subject to the release of AHDB's recommended list for 2023-24 in the next few days. So the slides I show you at the moment represent the provisional position. What I'll do today is focus on spring cereals, and I'll just give at the end an update on where we're going with choices for winter barley and for winter wheat. So I'll include the spring barley market position of the leading varieties and indicate the removal of two varieties that have to date had minor use in Scotland. In oats, spring oats, we've had some consolidation on the list, so I'll just indicate the position of the main varieties here. And then with spring wheat, here the list is relatively long, with some leading varieties supported by potentially 3 or 4 new entries with milling quality. So starting with the spring barley position, so here I've got the MBC, the Malting Barley Committee position in terms of full approval. So we've got Laureate and LG Diablo for both malt distilling and brewing uses, and then KWS Sassy and Firefox for malt distilling. You'll note that Firefox here I've indicated new by this, so this relates to its promotion to the malt distilling full approval earlier in the autumn. And then these 4 are supported by Fairing for grain distilling. Now, in terms of intake, Laureate has dominated the intake with just over 60%, and this is ably supported by LG Diablo and Sassy with around about 19 and 15% intake respectively. But together with Fairing, these varieties account for around about 96% of the Scottish intake. The other variety there, Skyway, is still provisionally approved by the MBC for brewing use. So the final decision on this variety will be made in the coming spring 2003. So in terms of data table and position, bear in mind that this is provisional, and the figures will be subject to minor change as AHDB data is launched. We can see here that Firefox, with its status with the MBC, now moves from P3 to fully recommended, and you'll note there that SY Tungsten is now going to be coming off of the Scottish list. And this is because after 2 years of macro scale testing, that the variety has not met the requirements to achieve its full approval status from the malting sector. So this will now be coming off of the list. So in terms of agronomic features here, across our main choices, you can see that all of the varieties are relatively good in terms of having low screenings. There's a range of different maturities here, Firefox being the earliest, and a spread also in terms of specific weight. So some variation among the leading varieties in terms of those features. So moving on just with a little bit more on the brackling and disease resistance. But as I say, the figures are subject to change as the new HDB tables are released in the coming days. So generally good for brackling resistance across the varieties. One is a little bit weaker, and the disease still to focus on in terms of crop protection is Rhynchosporium. We're faring sort of bucking the trend with a relatively good resistance. If we move on to the other category that we include on the Scottish list here, so this is for brewing and feed uses, you can see that we've got a Skyway, where we're suggesting this goes from P2 to P3, and the reason this is P3 rather than fully recommended is that we're still awaiting, as I say, for this confirmation of its status from the MBC as a brewing variety. You'll see here that SY Splendor, we've recommended that this is coming off of the list, so that it's a similar situation to SY Tungsten, where the variety, after 2 years of macro scale testing, has not met the required standards to progress to become fully approved. RGT Planet remains on the list as a very reliable all-round variety, so it's been very resilient, very consistent across different sites and seasons as a brewing or feed variety. The out-and-out feed variety is a Prospect here, and we're suggesting that this progresses from P3 to fully recommended for the Scottish list. Just to complete this section with some agronomic features, like the malting varieties, the malt distilling varieties, we've got pretty good values in terms of low screenings, Skyway and Planet, and also above average specific weights and relatively early maturity. So I think these three varieties certainly provide added value to the Scottish list as general use for feed in particular. Now, in terms of other changes, there's a possibility that we will be adding 2 or 3 varieties with malt distilling potential to the list, and up to 5 other varieties that have a brewing or feed uses, and a further variety that is an out-and-out feed variety. So these would have all been candidates from the last harvest, and once we get confirmation of their status on the HDB's UK wide list, then we'll make decisions for the Scottish list. Moving on to spring oats now, you can see here that we've got some leading varieties. Certainly Canyon and Conway provide most of the seed availability, so leading varieties in this crop, and these are supported by WPB Isabel, which is a variety with the best combination of grain quality characteristics. You note here that Merlin, a 4th variety here, this is progressing from provisional 1 to provisional 2, and note that another variety, WPB Elian, is being removed from the list. when we make this sort of decision about a variety, it tends to be because it has attracted limited or no interest from end use, and other aspects such as seed area is low, or there's some weakness in agronomic features. Just with a summary table here, so you can see Isabel progressing to fully recommended, Merlin making progress here, and what we regarded as Eliane as outclassed is now going to be removed from the list. So in the table, you can see some variation in yield there, and note the quality attributes there, kernel content screenings, and specific weight. And you can see here how Isabel looks very strong in some of those features, but note that it does have a higher than average yield loss when untreated. But as with all the tables, as I say, there's likely to be some change to these figures as the new data sets are launched in the AHDB's list. So moving on to spring wheat now and variety positions. So our main varieties here represents the different UK flour milling groups, so Malika, Kuchis, and Talisker. In terms of seed area, Kuchis will have most of the seed availability for the coming season. So it's good representation from these standards across the different groups here, and 3 varieties making progress are WPB Escape, that moves to fully recommended now. This is a feed variety, and then KWS Fixum and KWS Lardum, so Fixum feed and Lardum Group 1 moving from P1 to P2. So this provides a good selection within the spring wheat crop. As I mentioned before, that there's a possibility that more spring wheat varieties could be added to the list. So there's up to 4 new ones with milling quality. So we'll look out for these if these go forwards in the next few days. And one variety, KWS Giraffe, a Group 2, will be removed from the Scottish list. Just another summary table here again, just indicating the changes with Fixum and Lardum progressing here, WPB Escape also here, and Giraffe coming off of the list. So you can see good representation across the different UK flour milling groups. So I've just finished now with an update on the winter cereals. We'll say more about these at events in spring next year and summer next year. But so on winter barley, overall the list is progressing well and continues to look strong. And here we've got 4 varieties that are progressing from provisional stage 2 to fully recommended. So TARDIS and Bolton, 2-row feed varieties, and 2 6-row hybrids, SY Kingston and SY Thunderbolt, really providing some added value to the list. And following those 4, we've got more choices on the list. So all were added to the Scottish list last year, and that these progressed to provisional stage 2. So LG Dazzle, Lightning, KWS Ferris, and SY Canyon. Ferris is the variety, as you may recall, that has the tolerance to BYDV, and SY Canyon is another one in the series of 6-row hybrids. In terms of other changes, there are several varieties becoming outclassed, and others that will be removed from the Scottish list. So becoming outclassed includes Funky and Bazooka, and KWS Orwell and Bordeaux will be removed from the Scottish list. In terms of new varieties, it looks as though we could be adding a new quite exciting 2-row feed variety, and also another hybrid 6-row. Both varieties have good yield, good untreated yield, and specific weight. So we'll be able to confirm that information when the Scottish list is launched towards mid-December. And just finishing with winter wheat. In terms of our main varieties, the soft varieties, we've got LG Illuminate progressing from P2 to R. So this group 3 variety that suits distilling is making progress. And then progress from provisional stage 1 to P2. We've got 6 varieties here. So RGT Stokes and RGT Bairstow, both soft feed and distilling varieties making progress. And also KWS Briam, a group 3 variety with also distilling potential, also having this status. In the hard textured wheats, we've got 3 varieties here that are relatively good in their untreated yields. So feed varieties KWS Dorsum and LG Typhoon are also progressing well, and the UK flour millers KWS Palladium, so group 2 here, is also progressing well, and that does have a very good untreated yield on latest figures. So we'll see how all of this yield information or the other agronomic values change as the new AHDB lists are launched. But we're hoping that this selection does provide plenty of options in terms of some agronomic strengths for our main markets. Another variety, Swallow, soft feed variety suited to distilling, is progressing from P2 to P3 rather than R, and the reason for that is we just want to give it another provisional year as the variety develops interest. As with winter barley, several varieties are becoming outclassed, so including KWS Barrel, Elation and Gleam, and some others will be removed from the Scottish list, so including Spotlight, Jackal and Illicit. I think you can see there's plenty of good choice among the newer varieties to replace these outclassed and removed varieties. In terms of what might be added as new varieties, well, there are several options in both the hard and soft textured wheats. So we'll be confirming this towards mid-December. So in summary, we've got consolidation in both the spring barley and spring oat lists here. So loss of 2 varieties which to date had minor use that have not made progress. And so I think with our main choices, we've got good representation for malt distilling and also some brewing use as well. Oats, we've got the 4 main choices, no new entries for this recommended list, but 4 strong varieties here. And as I mentioned before, in spring wheat, we're likely to be getting a longer list, particularly with addition of some new milling varieties. Winter barley choice remains strong, with newer varieties providing this added improved agronomic value. And with wheat, we're encouraged by several varieties progressing to provisional stage 2 to replace those outclassed and removed from the list. So thanks very much for listening. If you do want to follow anything up, then please consult my colleagues through SRUC and FAS, or please contact me with my email details below. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, and thank you very much, Steve. Hopefully that whets your appetite as to looking at the recommended list. We had this time last year, the recommended list was out, and it would have been nice to have, but unfortunately with delays, it's probably should be out shortly. So hopefully that's given you a wee whetted your appetite for the varieties for next year. Anyway, last speaker of the night is going to be David Ross, looking at soil and nutrient management. This time last year, we thought fertilizer prices were expensive, but gee whiz, what a roller coaster we've been on this year. It's went even more expensive. So David's going to give us an update as to what we should be looking at. So David, are we ready?
I'm hoping so.
Good, good. Right, okay.
Right, thank you very much, Ewan. Thank you, everybody. I hope you found this evening interesting. My topic this evening is looking at soil and nutrient management, and I'm really going to look at fertilizer and what it's been doing and what we can what we need to look at for this coming season. So firstly, I just wanted to have a look at what the market was doing. So at the moment, you can see the this is prices for HDB. So this is taken last week. So October 22, ammonium nitrate was looking to be about 870. I think it is starting to come back a bit from what I can see. It hasn't moved since September, pretty much the same, but it's up 48% from where it was last October. So we're still seeing that quite high compared to the previous year. And so we're also seeing muriate of potash maybe just slipping back slightly, but still up significantly for last year. And the same with triple superphosphate, back a little bit at the moment, but still up significantly from last year. And if we look at the next slide, which looks at the same period sort of last year, it was up significantly from October 2 years ago. So we're looking at something like, for ammonium nitrate, something like 200%, 220% of an increase from where it was in October 2020. So it certainly makes us think and focus a mind on what we're going to do with fertilizer. On the back of that, we've got the cost or the price of our grain coming back. So we obviously hit the highs of the 320, 330, 300 pound plus back in May sort of time, and then it's gradually come back and fluctuated a bit through the rest of the year. So it's difficult to know what's going to happen. There's lots of things that's affecting that at the moment, but this year could be the year where we've got fairly expensive fertilizer sitting in the shed, and the price of grain or the price of wheat is not necessarily going to be as strong as we need it to make a decent margin. So this is just future prices. Again, this is this time last year. So we're looking at, if you look at a November 22 price, was it 204 last year? Okay, it did a lot, it moved a lot from then till now. But this year we're speaking about a November 23 price around about 241. I think it's moved a little bit again, just the last couple of days. So we need to be thinking about that when we try and work out how much nitrogen we're going to use for the season. And I was just going to speak about the break-even ratio. So there is a technical note, which is technical 731, which runs through this, but it's based on a 3-to-1 ratio between that 3 kilos of grain is needed to pay for each 1 kilo of nitrogen, and oilseed rape has a ratio of 2.5-to-1. Okay, so I'm just going to run through the calculation to let you see what that looks like for this season. So to work it out, you need to take well, it's the ratio between the kilo of grain needed to pay for a kilo of nitrogen. So you take the price per ton of fertilizer, times it by 100, and then take the percentage of N in fertilizer and times it by 10, which gives you your pence per kilo of nitrogen. You take your price for your per ton of grain and then divide that by 10, which gives you your pence per kilo of grain or seed. Oops, sorry. And then your break-even ratio is your pence per kilo of grain over your pence per kilo of grain, pence per kilo N over pence per kilo of grain. So if we work through this numbers for this year, we've got ammonium nitrate, and this is a price last week. I'm not sure what it's done. I think it might have moved a little bit this week, but it was a 740 for ammonium nitrate. So if you take that works out at £2.21 a kilo. Now feed wheat, and if you take that futures price at November 22 at 241 a ton, makes it 24 pence a kilo. So the break-even ratio at the moment is sitting at 9.2-to-1. Now, this table looks at the different break-even ratios. So if you're above 7.5 of a break-even ratio, in theory, you should be reducing your nitrogen content for winter cereals and oilseed rape by around 55 kilos. And then for spring cereals, it should be around 40 kilos at that level. Now, the thing to be really careful about here is it actually depends whereabout on the response curve you already are. So it's okay saying that knock it back 55 kilos, but depending on where you are and how much you're putting on, it's where there'll be a saving or not from doing that. So if you look at this is a typical nitrogen response curve that Ian showed earlier. So if you're sitting at 220 kilos, you can easily come back 40 kilos to 180 kilos of nitrogen and not have a huge amount of difference in the yield. So that's the difference between those two levels. But if you are sitting at 180 kilos and you come down to 130 kilos, then obviously there's a bigger response to those. There's a bigger loss in yield between those two figures. And then in spring barley, it's the response curve is even steeper. So depending on where you are within here, what level you're putting at, really determines how much you feel you can cut back on not have a huge effect on yield. I know a lot of winter wheat crops that's grown 180 kilos this year and had the best yields we've had in a long time, but that's a lot to do with the season that there was as well. And it does make you wonder how much effect nitrogen is actually having and how much it is just the growing season that affects it. So, and the same with spring barley, there's a lot of crops at the maybe 110 sort of 110 mark is producing a good crop as well. So it's all to think about where you are on this curve at the moment and where you think you can be. So just put this together to have a look at looking at different rates and the difference between the value in the reduction in yield. So for each of these N rates here, so we'll go for 220 down to 100 kilos. We've got the expected yield that we'll see from the curve in the next column. We've then got how much is reduced by reducing that amount of nitrogen. We've got the value of the yield that has been reduced, and then the value of the fertilizer saved. And at the break-even ratio and the numbers we've got at the moment, we can come back to somewhere between 140 and 160 kilos, and that would be the kind of economic optimum at the minute. Now, I know a few folk will probably come down as far as that, but it does show that there is a difference, that you could come down to this sort of levels and have little effect, or you could have a positive effect on your own finances because of the difference. Just a little slide on best value for nitrogen prices at the minute. Well, there seem to be, there are a little bit of variable, so just take these with a little bit of pinch of salt, but they are round about what they are at the moment. So ammonium nitrate, 740 a kilo, so 740 a ton, 221 a kilo of nitrogen. So to get 180 kilos for nitrogen on wheat, you're speaking about £400. Urea, obviously 46%, a roughly comparable price at the minute. So, but because there's more nitrogen, slightly cheaper per kilo N. So it's coming down to about 288 for 180 kilos. And then I just put in calcium ammonium nitrate as well. Round about the 640 mark is a bit more expensive. So 180 kilos is costing 426. And then this column just looks at spring barley to give you a bit of an idea of what that 110 kilos of nitrogen in spring barley is costing. So urea looks like the cheap option from this, but you've got to be a little bit careful. There is potential increased losses from volatilization in warm, dry, windy conditions. Depending on who you read, it's likely to be somewhere between 5 and 20%. It might be less than that, but it's very, very dependent on the conditions when you are applying it. You can use urease inhibitors, so protected urea, which can help to reduce this. And there's a lot of chat in England at the moment about some new rules that's coming along on how to use that, but that's England only at the moment. So just thinking about margin, this is some figures that came from Farm Bench this is harvest 2021, and thinking about the cost of fertilizer per ton. So for these crops, when they're yielding this sort of level of yield, it's somewhere between 20 and 27 quid, 21 and 27 quid that the fertilizer is actually costing now. Just with all the other costs that's added on, it brings a big variation in cost of production for slightly more nitrogen on these wheat crops and slightly different yields, but not massively different. But certainly is given a different margin to those that are producing it. Now, roughly this year, that fertilizer is, if you buy it at today's prices, it's somewhere between 35 and 45 pound a ton that will now become. So this is going to change these numbers quite significantly, and along with other changes in energy and fuel and electric, it's going to change these figures as well. So this margins are definitely going to be eroded this next year. And if we look at spring barley, again, similar kind of numbers, obviously less yield, fertilizer somewhere between around about the 21 to 23 pound per ton. But if you look at it this year, it's going to be somewhere between 25 and 40 pound a ton, depending on how you've bought it and what the yield looks like. So again, something else to think about and where you sit on this margin scale. Sulfur, I was just going to mention sulfur, depending on what sort of fertilizer you're looking at, and where you decide to source that from. You need to make sure there's a good lump of sulfur in there. So there's obviously there's now less sulfur floating about in the atmosphere than there was before. Soil analysis is not the best for predicting it, and it can be leached over winter, especially in light soils and heavy rainfall. Yield is one of those that can reduce. Sulfur is one of those that can reduce yield, even though you don't see symptoms. So it can be robbing yield without anything visible to the eye. And again, it's one of those that's used in the conversion, or the nitrogen use efficiency. How well the plant uses nitrogen is based on how much sulfur there is as well. So really important. Can't help with grain quality, and at the moment it's a cost-effective addition, and it's not associated with any major environmental issues. We're not being chased for that one at the moment. So sulfur on crops. So what they're needing: winter oilseed rape and brassica crops are looking about 75 kilos ISO3. Cereals and spring oilseed rape and silage ground as well, we're looking at about 40 kilos, and potatoes and peas around about 25 kilos. So trying to get that onto the crop. I've seen it in a cotton silage situation where it can make a significant difference to yield just by adding in that sulfur element into the mix. So manures, mucks and slurries is a good source of sulfur, especially when you're starting putting these on at 25-30 tonne a hectare. It certainly starts to mount up with the amount of sulfur that's going on. So a really good source. And then on the side here, I've just tagged on the likely sort of availability of some of that sulfur if it's applied for manures in the spring. So again, really good source of NP and K, but also sulfur in there as well, which helps things along. Sulfur containing fertilizer, so just a few of them up there. We've got like ammonium sulfate, which is used quite readily for potatoes and stuff, on cereals. It tends to be a bit acidic, so you've got to be a little bit careful with that. But one of the ones that is becoming more and more common is polysulfate. It's about, I think it's around the 350, 360 pound a tonne at the moment. And that might be a good source of sulfur depending on your situation. And if you can only buy a nitrogen that doesn't have a sulfur element to it, then this might be a way of doing it. So there's a few different ways that you can get that onto the crop. So solid versus liquid, we've got quite a few people who are moving towards liquid. Just a few of the pros and cons that we've got there. I think quite a few folk are getting a bit fed up, no matter how good your spreader is, that we're getting this headland effect, that the yield's tailing off in that bit of the field next to the headland, and liquid gets around that to a certain degree, and that you don't seem to have that same effect. So we're seeing liquid is pros being kind of, it's highly accurate, really accurate. You don't see that headland effect, which can be, I've had folk go up to half a tonne a hectare a difference between those headlands and the rest of the crop. It's more effective in kind of dry conditions, which we saw this year in the spring. There's benefits because there's no disposal. It does utilise the sprayer more, whether that's a pro or a con. It depends on the setup, and there can be reduced labour because depending on how you're set up, maybe then I hear a guy chasing bags of fert out to the spinner, and it's less affected by weather conditions, i.e. it can be applied when it's raining, whereas solid can't be doing that. Some of the cons that we certainly see, you've got to be aware of scorch. Bright sunny days can scorch, depending on the product used. You're obviously working, you need bonded storage, and you've got a cost of tanks or a rent for tanks to be able to do that. It can be corrosive to your machinery. Slower application, potentially, depending on how much you're putting on. A bit less choice of supplier, and it can be a lower concentration of nutrients depending on what there is. There. Solid fertiliser, obviously, you never really get any scorch issues. Generally easy storage, quick application, but you've got this bug disposal. It's less accurate. You have the headland effect with that, and can be more affected by weather conditions, i.e. you kind of spread the rain and wind can cause you just problems as well. And maybe there's a bit more logistics with solid, depending on the size of your unit and how you're operating. So a few pros and cons to that. As far as cost, I did a bit of calculating on this, and there's about the £15 to £20 a difference between a typical application of solid fertiliser and a typical application of a liquid fertiliser. Yeah, it's slightly more expensive, but is that worth? We're not having the headland effect, and the pros the pros of the liquid product. Does it actually help things at the end of the day? It all depends on your unit and what you're trying to achieve and what you've got to work with. But certainly seeing a trend more towards liquid in some parts of the country. And then the last thing I just wanted to speak about, there's one or two guys mixing their own, and then there's word about, is that actually cheaper to do that? Then I think the main savings to be had is if you can find a source of distressed product, something that can't go through a spinner, something that's got wet or been damaged in transit. It can be a bit cheaper to buy that stuff in bulk. You sort of need a bit of urea, some ammonium sulfate, water, some tanks, sometimes a bit of heat helps to get it mixed. And you need a mixer tank and pump to melt the product into solution. That's what a lot of these guys are doing. It's actually just melting urea or melting a recipe of urea and ammonium sulfate to come up with the right concentration. From what I understand, there's more circulation agitation, the better. It tends to mix better and sits better in solution. But there is a bit of labour requirement, and there's with the cost of electric, there is running pumps and bits and pieces, and the capital outlay setting up a kind of unit to be able to do it. But I mean, some of these guys are speaking 4 or 5 grand to be able to put that together. Storage, again, something to think about if you need a lot of product, and you need to think about it is the reactions are less efficient. So sometimes in warm weather conditions, they work better than in cold conditions. So it's all about when you need the product and when you want to take it out. You need a recipe. There is a few recipes about for mixing your own. And it's better just to check specific weights and get some analyzed to check that the recipe that you've put together is the right sort of product for what you're trying to do, and trying to get that mix of nitrogen and sulfur in there as well. So potentially a little bit of money to be saved, a bit of work in doing that though, and you do need a bit of capital investment to bring that stuff to bring that together. So yeah, and I think that is what I was wanting to speak to you about this evening. And if anybody's got any questions, then by all means, ask away.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Much appreciated. And just on cue, as you asked for questions, Alex Robertson's got a wee question with regards to talk of inhibitors with liquid fertilizer. He thinks Agri has a product called LiquiSafe, which is suggesting it can put all N on in one pass. What's your thoughts?
It really depends on what it's actually trying to do, but there is a you need to understand what it was trying to do. There was some work a while ago looking at putting it all on one versus variable applications. Ian might be able to be better placed to speak about that, but there was some work done that in the past, and I think the little and often was found to be better than everything in one go. Is that right, Ian?
Well, yeah. Firstly, I should put my camera on, shouldn't I? I don't have any experience. I don't actually know what that product is, so I can't comment on that one specifically. But coming back to your little and often versus putting it all in one or even two. And when we've done that with spring barley, it certainly helps when the soil's dry, because you're less likely to dump it all on and then find it can't be taken up by the crop. And that could be an issue based on what Neil was talking about earlier on with the dry springs that we've got. But when they did some trial work on this, I think at ADAS, it worked. There was an improvement in some cases, but I don't think it was very consistent. So I don't think it was a marginal benefit, I think, and it only worked in some situations. It's probably when the soil is going to be dry as well, and that was with winter wheat, and that was probably looking at 4 or 5 applications. You know, an experimental little and often, as opposed to the typical two-way split.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ian, for helping there. Much appreciated. Any other questions? I see there is a question come in about basis and Naroso points, which brings me nicely on talking that yes, they have been applied for. I've not actually got the numbers. Hold on, let's see if we can get. So I was just going to plan to email out. We've taken a note of everyone that's registered on tonight, and that if anyone's wanting to apply, please email their basis or Naroso number to me. But we will send a list of all those that have attended tonight to basis and Naroso, so as well, just to tally it up. If you, and that we can also email out the numbers to everyone that's attended as well, so that you can take a note of the numbers yourself for your own tally. And that they should be coming shortly. They were applied for a couple of weeks ago, but apologies as regards not having them here for presentation tonight. But we'll hopefully get things sorted for that. I see there's another question asking about the agronomy roadshow dates for January. Neil, do you have dates for the agronomy roadshow?
I do. I was just checking. It's the 12th, I think. That's still to be confirmed, but I think there's going to be, let me see, 18th. 18th is the Aberdeen one.
Okay.
And I think there's one on the Perth one is the 12th of January. And there's still
one on the 10th as well.
Yes,
as Neil, I think
there is, but that's usually the Carfrey Mill one. But apparently, they can't get Carfrey Mill this year, so that's to be confirmed. So Perth and Aberdeen are confirmed, 12th and 18th, but we're still waiting for to hear about the 10th.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Neil. It sounds like there'll have to be a new venue for those of you in the borders. on that. I don't know the reasons behind it, but yes. But thank you for asking the question, Elaine, because it's usually a good, well-attended event. I know an Aberdeenshire event anyway, so hopefully we'll see a lot of you at that event there, because it's usually a further learning event for us all as regards for the season ahead. Well, that's it, folks, for tonight. But I can't but thank you all for coming along. I hope you've all been able to learn something. Thank you for putting the dates on the chat, Neil. As I said, thanks for coming along. I hope you've been able to learn something and gained some valuable pointers for growing your crops next year. As it's been highlighted, this is a Farm Advisory Service funded event, and it goes without saying that that we will be sending out a questionnaire to you all as regards being able to give us a bit of feedback as to how the meetings went. Hold on, trying to do too many jobs at once. But yes, if you can please send we will send out a feedback request through email, and if you can fill it in, that'd be much appreciated, because this does help plan and develop and change future events as regards what tailoring to what you want. So as again, thank you very much for attending. Hope you have a good night, and hope you enjoy the football tomorrow night. Take care, everyone. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Ewan.
Ewan.
Thanks, folks.